Welcome, everyone, to the Notre Dame Forum event, New and Old Wars, New and Old Challenges of Peace. Welcome to those of you who are here in person and those of you who are watching via live stream. It's good to have you here this evening. My name is Jerry Powers. I'm Director of Catholic Peacebuilding Studies of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies of the Keough School of Global Affairs here at Notre Dame. And I'd like to introduce Father John Jenkins, CSC, who has served as University of Notre Dame's president since 2005. As president, he has been committed to combining teaching and research excellence with the cultivation of the deeper purposes of Catholic higher education, to educate the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, to do good in the world. As part of his effort to promote civil discourse on doing good in the world, Father Jenkins has addressed one of the issues that we will discuss tonight, the ethics of nuclear weapons. Some of you might be aware that in November 2017, at a major Vatican conference attended by 11 Nobel Peace laureates, Pope Francis issued a groundbreaking statement condemning not only the use, but the possession of nuclear weapons. What you might not know is that at the invitation of the Holy See, Father Jenkins led Notre Dame's effort, together with Georgetown, the U.S. Bishops' Conference, and Catholic University of America and others, to collaborate with the Holy See to help make that event a reality. A few years earlier, in 2014, Father Jenkins participated in and co-sponsored a major convening of bishops, scholars, and policymakers on Catholic ethics and nuclear weapons that was held at Stanford University. That event was hosted by former Secretary of State George Shultz and former Secretary of Defense William Perry, along with Senator Sam Nunn's Nuclear Threat Initiative. In his statement for that conference, Father Jenkins said, "Catholic universities have the opportunity to work closely with the U.S. Catholic bishops and the Holy See, who have played a leading role in shaping the moral debate on nuclear weapons. Tonight's event is the latest example of Father Jenkins' commitment to ensuring that Notre Dame remains an enthusiastic partner in working with church leaders and the wider community on the challenges posed by nuclear weapons and other pressing issues of war and peace." Father Jenkins.
Jerry, that was extremely generous, and it was under your tutelage that I undertook many of these efforts, so thank you. And thanks to everyone for coming this evening. It's great to see such a wonderful crowd here. Tonight's event, New and Old Wars, New and Old Challenges to Peace, is one of a series we have sponsored this academic year as part of the Notre Dame Forum. Since we established it in 2005, each year we invited a campus-wide dialogue about an issue of importance to the university, the nation, and the world. The topic we have chosen for this academic year is war and peace. In considering this topic, we are guided by Pope Francis' words in Against War, Building a Culture of Peace. He said, "Together we must commit ourselves to building a world that is more peaceful because it is more just, where peace triumphs, not the folly of war." We know the folly of war is evident today in Ukraine and the heightened risk of nuclear war. It's also evident, but mostly invisible, in largely ignored conflicts in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, Myanmar, and far too many other places. Catholic community, all of us, have a responsibility to know, live out, and further develop the Church's rich tradition of reflection and action on war and peace. Catholic universities have an important role here, working in collaboration with church leaders and other Catholic institutions, such as Catholic Relief Services. We are blessed to have at Notre Dame an abundance of talented scholars, students, and graduates, some of whom are here tonight, who work collaboratively to build peace through their teaching, research, policy work, advocacy, and accompaniment of victims of war. And we are especially delighted to welcome tonight Cardinal Robert McElroy to campus to speak to us about renewing Catholic teaching on war and peace. He is a great pastoral and intellectual leader in the church today, helping shepherd Pope Francis's synodal process in which the Church seeks to discover what the Lord expects from it in the third millennium. As Jerry mentioned, in 2014, I was fortunate enough to spend time with him and a number of other bishops and scholars at Stanford discussing nuclear disarmament. He's inspiring in the way he combines a great intellect, genuine humility, and a spirit of service. Thank you, Eminence, for joining us once more to continue these conversations. And now I'm going to ask my friend Jerry Powers back to the podium to introduce our speaker tonight. Jerry.
I think I was asked to introduce Cardinal McElroy because I worked for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops for about 18 years, so I speak bishop. Thank you, Father Jenkins. Father Jenkins noted that the folly of war is evident from Ukraine and Congo to South Sudan and Myanmar. As foreign policies are being rethought in light of these new and old wars, the need for a moral compass to point the way toward peace is as great as ever. At the height of the Cold War, two seminal documents, Pacem and Terris in 1963 and the U.S. Bishop's Challenge of Peace in 1983, attempted to provide that moral compass. Pacem and Terris did so in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. Bishop's Peace Pastoral did so at a time not too different from today, when a nuclear arms race was raging and some leaders were talking about fighting and winning a nuclear war. Today, Pope Francis' encyclicals and statements are offering a moral compass. They have ignited a new debate about the ethics of nonviolence, nuclear deterrence, and war and peace. This evening, we are privileged to have a church leader who is playing a major role in that debate. Cardinal McElroy has been the Bishop of San Diego since 2015, and in 2022, Pope Francis elevated him to Cardinal. Pope Francis also appointed him to serve on the Vatican dicasteries for promoting integral human development and for laity, family, and life. In some ways, Cardinal McElroy has not followed the typical path to bishop. He did spend, to be sure, several years in the chancery as a priest secretary to San Francisco Archbishop Quinn, but he also served more than 20 years in parishes, including the parish that his parents grew up in. Like many bishops, he has a licentiate in theology and a doctorate in moral theology, but he also has a master's in U.S. history and a doctorate in political science from Stanford University. Stanford keeps coming up. His scholarly contributions include two books, The Search for an American Public Theology and Morality in American Foreign Policy. And he writes and speaks frequently on theology, ethics, and public policy. Now, all of that is very interesting, but the most important thing you need to know about Cardinal McElroy is that his brother, his sister, and his sister-in-law and his niece went to Notre Dame. He was invited to join them 5 decades ago, but for reasons that shall remain a theological mystery, he went to Harvard instead. So thank you, Your Eminence, for sharing your wisdom with us this evening, and please join me in welcoming Cardinal McElroy.
I want to begin by thanking this community. This university has been a distinguished contributor to the life of the church in the United States. At the middle of the last century, there was a great discussion within this country about what should a Catholic university be. Should it be educating undergraduates? Yes. Should it be preparing professional schools? Yes. But there was a commitment made in the 1950s to deepen the sense of intellectual contribution through the vast array of social sciences and humanities and sciences to the wider society, and particularly to bringing to bear the knowledge of Catholic university faculties and graduates on the major issues that our world was presented with. And so the university has certainly lived up to that challenge of 75 years ago, and it's always an honor for me to be here for that reason. Before beginning, I just want to, Jerry's comments made me think on one thing. In the 80s, literally it was being an active question in Catholic doctrine. Could we fight and win a nuclear war? And at that period of time, we had just gone through, most of you are too young to remember this, of course, a gas crisis. And so during the gas crisis, there wasn't enough gas in the United States, so you could only get gas every other day. And you could only get gas, you had to have, like on Mondays, if you had an odd-numbered license plate, you could get gas. But if you had an even-numbered one, you could not. How many of you remember this? And then the opposite on Tuesday, okay. During this question of the winnable nuclear war, literally FEMA, which is the emergency preparedness, came up with a system where in case of imminent nuclear attack, that was going to be coming, it was threatening, all odd-numbered cars would be allowed to go out of the city before all even-numbered cars. This is literally true. That's living with madness. And I think that needs to be the context how we think about the nuclear question now. That we get used to it and think, oh yeah, this is normal. And it can't be normal. This year marks the 60th anniversary of Pacem and Terris and the 40th anniversary of the Challenge of Peace, the American Bishop's pastoral letter on questions of war and peace. It's hard to overestimate the impact of Pacem and Terris within both the Catholic community and the international community as a whole. Written in the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it arose from a conviction that the Church must speak forcefully to the question of peace from its rich tradition, but must also do so with profound attention to the signs of the times. Pope John set forth a comprehensive framework for building authentic peace in the world by outlining the fundamental rights that alone can guarantee a lasting peace, as well as providing a profound reflection upon the implications of the international community that was emerging in the 1960s. Finally, in Pacem and Terris, Pope John placed the threat of nuclear weapons vividly in front of the world and proclaimed, quote, "In this age of ours, which prides itself on its atomic power, it is irrational to think that war is a proper way to obtain justice for violated rights," unquote. 20 years after the issuance of Pacem and Terris, the Catholic bishops of the U.S. took up the daunting task of applying the teachings of the Vatican Council, as well as those of Pope John, Pope Paul VI, and Pope John Paul II, to the deeply polarized debate on war and nuclear weapons in America. Their resulting pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response, was a penetrating and comprehensive catechesis for the Catholic community and a witness of faith and wisdom for American society as a whole. The Challenge of Peace set forth the substantive conception of peace that arises from the Scriptures and the tradition of human reason. The same conception of peace rooted in justice and in human rights that had been the foundation of Pacem and Terris. It presented both the tradition of nonviolence and the legitimate use of military means to defend human rights as authentic expressions of Catholic faith designed to attain the same goal, namely the comprehensive protection of humanity under attack. And the pastoral letter of the bishops consistently presented defense of war as a last resort to its analysis of the challenges which the world was facing. Perhaps most importantly of all, the Challenge of Peace addressed the crisis of nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as wider questions of nuclear proliferation. The bishops proclaimed that the combination of nuclear threats and the prevalence of conventional war in the world using highly advanced weapon systems had created, quote, a new moment that demanded specific application of Catholic teaching on war and peace to particular policy questions. For this reason, the Challenge of Peace dealt in detail with the issues of counterpopulation nuclear warfare, the initiation of nuclear war, the concept of limited nuclear war and the pathways to reversing nuclear proliferation. This bishop's statement deeply informed public policy, educated millions of Catholics about the Church's teaching on war and peace, and provided an enduring example of how bishops could teach effectively on volatile questions in a polarized environment. Our new moment. 40 years have passed since the challenge of peace. To put that in perspective, this is a longer period than that between the dropping of atomic bombs on Japan and the issuance of the bishop's pastoral letter in the United States. As the bishops of the United States understood in 1983, the changes in the nature of warfare in the international community had created a new moment in 1983 that demanded a renewed understanding and application of Catholic teaching on war and peace amidst changed circumstances. With the passage of these 40 years, we too stand in a new moment. As a consequence, 3 major shifts in Catholic thinking are taking place. The continuation of wars among nations and within societies, enlisting devastating weapons and resulting in countless deaths, have pointed to the need to fundamentally renew and prioritize the claim of nonviolent action as the central tenet of Catholic teaching on war and peace. The atrophying of the just war framework as an effective constraint on war or pathway to peace calls the Church to redesign the just war framework for permitting war in dire circumstances. And the failure of nuclear deterrence as, quote, a step on the way to nuclear disarmament, unquote, has produced a situation where we are facing the breakdown of the arms control regime and the possibility of the use of tactical nuclear weapons. The Church must engage with the world in this moment in order to contribute perspective of Catholic faith and tradition in a perilous age. And the Church of the United States must grapple with these foundational questions if we are to be faithful to our lives as citizens and believers. The centrality of an ethic of nonviolence. Ever since Pacem and Terris was written, every successive pope has pointed to the moral depravity of war. Pope John proclaimed, quote, "It's hardly possible to imagine that in an atomic era, war could be used as an instrument of justice," unquote. Pope Paul VI journeyed to the United Nations to plead with the world, no more war, war never again. Pope John Paul II taught that war is never an appropriate way to settle disputes among peoples. Quote, "It has never been and it will never be," unquote. Joseph Ratzinger chose the name Benedict to tie his entire pontificate to that of Benedict XV, who tried to end all war. But it is Pope Francis who has utilized the trajectory of all of these statements to construct a framework for Catholic teaching on war and peace that places nonviolence rather than the just war ethic as the dominant prism through which to evaluate decisions in situations of deep conflict. In Fratelli Tutti, he writes, quote, "We can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it's very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war," unquote. Francis is even clearer in his elaboration of the horrific nature of war as it has emerged in our times. Quote, "Every war leaves our world worse off than it was before. War is a failure of politics and humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. Let us not remain mired in theoretical discussions, but touch the wounded flesh of the victims. Let us look once more to those civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask the victims themselves. Let us think of the refugees and the displaced. those who suffer the effects of atomic radiation or chemical attacks, the mothers who lost their children, and the boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil that lies at the heart of war. Nor will it trouble us, the Pope said, to be naive for choosing peace, unquote. The charge of naivety traditionally leveled against advocates of nonviolence has been gravely diminished in its legitimacy in recent years through a series of studies of real-world conflicts. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan's book, Why Civil Resistance Works, use quantitative analysis from a wide variety of conflicts within and among nations. Some ended in armed conflict and others did not. But their demonstration that nonviolent resistance can often be significantly more effective than armed defense in achieving the sustainable vindication of human rights in the forms of conflict that have emerged as the dominant confrontations of our day lends tremendous strength to the proposition that the Church should place nonviolent resistance at the center of its theology of war and peace. If one were to be asked in 1983 to state what framework stood as the central point of reference for the Church in armed conflict, they would have said, correctly, the just war theory. If we are asked today to answer that same question, we must answer comprehensive nonviolence. Extreme cases. Even in recognizing the gospel exhortations to reject warfare in all of its forms, and even in recognizing the manifest frequent superiority of outcomes through nonviolent resistance, there are instances which call out for military action against profoundly barbaric aggression. We are witnessing just such a moment in Ukraine. While one can criticize Ukraine and the West for not adequately seeking continuous de-escalation in their tensions with Russia in recent years, the moral claim for the defense of Ukraine is clear and compelling. A sovereign nation with a historic culture and identity were invaded with the goal of dismembering their homeland. Thus, the fundamental moral justification for military action is here unassailable. But does the Church have an ethic in the present day which can help us navigate the moral choices that Ukraine and its allies must make in repelling the Russian invasion? The just war would have traditionally occupied this space in Catholic thinking. And certainly some elements of that tradition, for example, the prohibition of direct attacks upon civilians and the principle of proportionality for all military actions, are as effective in their moral witness and realism as they have ever been. But the overarching strategic framework of the just war tradition, the jus ad bellum, has become hobbled in its ability to provide effective, comprehensive guidance in the modern day. One problem, of course, is that for so many recent uses of the tradition to evaluate a decision for military action, the just war framework has operated as a source of justification for those already inclined to go to war, rather than as a constraint on war. The Iraq War, the second Iraq War in the United States was one of those, where the ethic was simply taken by decision makers as a validation of their pre-existing decision to go to war. One accelerant for this trend was the unfortunate statement in the Catechism of the Catholic Church that the evaluation of the just war criteria belongs to those who have a responsibility for the common good. Actually, in true just war theory, it is the objective moral reality which determines whether the jus ad bellum has been met, not the views of political leaders. But there are far wider reasons which make the just war tradition inadequate for decision-making in situations like Ukraine. The tradition is weak in two crucial areas of moral choice. The first is the moral requirement to actively and strenuously seek peace, even if it means making significant concessions. warfare expands war aims rather than reducing them. The just war tradition does not include a set of realistic moral criteria for seeking war termination. That lacuna needs to be fixed. The general principles of right intention, and proportionality are not focused enough to provide effective guidance in this area. If the war in Ukraine falls into protracted stalemate, this deficiency will become even clearer. Another major deficiency in the just war framework is its lack of attention to the moral obligations of other nations in minimizing a military conflict. Catholic theology has pointed unswervingly for the past century to the reality that an international society truly exists, and that a set of military, economic, and political obligations flow from that reality. So many of the wars we have witnessed in recent decades have effectively constituted surrogate wars of greater powers. We are now in a situation where a small nation is fighting heroically to defend itself, while the surrounding major military and economic powers supply enough weaponry and economic support to sustain the Ukrainians, but not so much that it might trigger catastrophic action by Russia. This is a moral minefield for which the just war tradition cannot provide a map. The central moral question that Ukraine raises touches upon the moral responsibilities of third parties in the conflict, which will probably in the end determine the outcome of this war. The new moment in which we are living demands a deep renewal, restructuring, and expansion of the Catholic teaching on the legitimacy of war in extreme situations, like Ukraine. There are ethical tools for this in Catholic teaching, but they must be forged into a larger contemporary ethic of war, so the ethics of war termination and moral obligations of all participants are clearer during ongoing conflicts. The specter of nuclear weapons. A final element of the new moment for Catholic teaching on war and peace in which we stand concerns the moral aseity of possessing nuclear weapons. The relationship of the imperative to eliminate nuclear weapons and the realities of deterrence have framed Catholic teaching for the past 60 years. Consistently, the Church has demanded that nuclear weapons be removed from the face of the earth. This element of Catholic doctrine has never changed. But the treatment of deterrence and how it conditions the moral imperative to eliminate nuclear weapons has shifted dramatically since the issue of Pacem and terris. Pope John was less troubled by the reality of deterrence itself than by the risks which nuclear testing would bring. Remember, at that time, nuclear testing was extensive and brought huge environmental problems and huge problems of letting nuclear war become unleashed in ever greater amounts. He said, even though the monstrous power of nuclear weapons does indeed act as a deterrent, there is reason to fear that the very testing of nuclear devices for war purposes can, if continued, lead to serious danger for various forms of life on the earth. By 1982, Pope John Paul II was emphasizing the temporary nature of the moral legitimation for the possession of nuclear weapons for deterrent purposes. Quote, the logic of nuclear deterrence cannot be considered a final goal or an appropriate and secure means for safeguarding international peace. For this reason, the bishop's pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, labeled nuclear deterrence, quote, as a step on the way to progressive disarmament, unquote. Pope Francis views nuclear deterrence not as a source of peace, but as a destabilizing element in the international system that creates a false sense of security, encourages the proliferation of nuclear weapons, threatens the environment, and robs from the poor. As a consequence, at a conference of the Vatican following the passage of the International Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, Pope Francis categorically condemned the possession of nuclear weapons as morally illicit. Discerning the implications of this dramatic shift in Catholic teaching, constitutes one of the central tasks for theologians, bishops, policymakers, and committed Catholics who work in the area of ethics and nuclear weapons. On this issue, successive moral positions of the Church regarding deterrence and possessions have all consciously been framed as interim ethics in anticipation of a better moment. That moment has never come. How can we realistically contribute in God's grace to bringing that moment to reality? Drew Christensen and Carol Sargent's splendid book, Forbidden, which I recommend to you, Receiving Pope Francis' Condemnation on Nuclear Weapons, points powerfully to the comprehensive moral discernment in action, which together can forge with the Catholic community a realistic, passionate framework, capable of creating, sustaining, and expanding a coherent pathway to advance the consistent magisterial call to eliminate nuclear weapons. By focusing on the variety of communities which will be necessary to build a nuclear-free world, the Catholic Peace-Building Network, in which Dr. Powers has such an active role, has given us hope and realism to all those who seek to realize the Catholic vision of peace. Archbishop John Wester of Santa Fe has provided a complementary pathway to advance a nuclear-free world. Rooted in a profoundly spiritual conviction that nuclear weapons simply must be eliminated, he has begun wide conversations on the ecclesial and public policy communities in the very state where the bomb was born and where nuclear technology is central to the state's economy. Archbishop Wester and his collaborators have the conviction which was united in his visit to Hiroshima, and it shares the same unswerving drive that characterized St. John Paul II's statement at Hiroshima. Our future on this planet, exposed as it is to nuclear annihilation, depends on one single factor. The world must make an about face. May we all be part of initiating that moral about face rather than simply waiting for a new moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cardinal McElroy, for your thoughtful and challenging remarks. The Church has been reflecting on the ethics of war and peace for 2,000 years, but even so, you remind us that we haven't got it all figured out, that there are still difficult moral questions that require further reflection. And as with any moral reflection, addressing today's moral challenges of war and peace requires dialogue with other religious and philosophical traditions and with other people from other disciplines. So with that in mind, we have invited 3 Notre Dame faculty members to have a conversation with Cardinal McElroy. Each of them writes and teaches about the ethics of war and peace, but they do so from very different vantage points. Major General Robert Latiff is a private consultant and an adjunct professor and chairman of the advisory board for Notre Dame's Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values. His military service included serving as commander of the NORAD Cheyenne Mountain Operations Center, that is, where it controls some of our nuclear weapons. He is a member of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist and is the author of Future War, Preparing for the New Global Battlefield and Future Peace, Technology, Aggression, and the Rush to War. Mary Ellen O'Connell is the Robert and Marion Short Professor of Law at Notre Dame Law School and Professor of International Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute. She specializes in international law on the use of force, dispute resolution, and legal theory. She is the author of or editor of 22 books, including The Art of Law in the International Community and Peace Through Law, Reflections on Pacem and Terris. She has been a vice president of the American Society of International Law and a professional military educator for the U.S. Department of Defense. And Rashid Omar is an associate professor of Islamic studies and peace building at the Kroc Institute. He specializes in religion and social engagement, Islamic ethics of war and peace, and interreligious peace building. His books include Islam Beyond Violent Extremism and Religion in Public Education. He splits his time between Notre Dame and South Africa, where he serves as imam at the Claremont Main Road Mosque in Cape Town, and he's a trustee of the Healing of Memories Institute in South Africa. So we have a cardinal, an imam, a general, and a lawyer.
I'm a professor.
There's got to be a good punchline. So somebody ask Chat GBT and see what you come up with, and save it for the reception. Cardinal McElroy, why don't we start with you? You've written and spoken a lot about polarization in the church and society. What about polarization around the issues of war and peace? Some have long criticized official Catholic teaching for being functionally pacifist, and many have criticized the Pope for being a nuclear pacifist. Some Ukrainians want the Pope to be stronger in standing up for their right to self-defense. So help the poor Pope out. What do you think? Is there a problem of within the church and the wider society of polarization around these issues of war and peace? And if so, what can be done about it?
I'd say a couple of things. One is on being functionally pacifist in Catholic theology and in Catholic teaching. I don't think that's been the dominant tradition. I think it should be more so, although I don't like using the word pacifism, because partly the word P-A-S-S-I-V-E comes across. That's why the word used more and more now is not nonviolent, active nonviolence, because it's a way of action that eschews violence in most circumstances and seeks to effect change. So what Pope Francis has been saying in this Fratelli Tutti is that's what should be at the centerpiece of how we handle conflict when conflict is serious in a society. That's our first, second, and third resorts. And then if things are truly extreme, and Ukraine is one of those, there is a long tradition of Catholic teaching, recourse to military action is justifiable. And so what I'm suggesting, and many in the church are suggesting, and what Pope Francis pointed to in Fratelli Tutti, is a shift from having just war be the declaration that's the center of Catholic teaching to having active nonviolence being the center and just war is on the side. It's still there. It's still important. It's still utilizable, but it's not the primary prism for how do we understand conflict in the world. So that would be my thought. As to the polarization, it is very difficult for me to understand the currents of American political thought on these issues today. That is, for so many years in the United States, we had fairly discernible groups and where they would stand on foreign policy issues as a whole and on questions of war and peace. There was broad consensus during many years. There would be periods of great contrast to Vietnam War, for example, and polarization then. But now I find it very unpredictable what issues people think about and how they take it within the framework of war and peace and what should be done. It is for me, even though I speak as somebody who's presenting active nonviolence as the centerpiece, to me it is stunning the number of people with influence in the Congress who wish to desert Ukraine. I find that difficult. So that the currents of society, which were so long fairly predictable, are really in turmoil, I think. And so it's polarized, but it's polarized not one side versus the other. It's polarized in many different permutations, so that on any given issue, it's very hard to know where people are going to be and where people in Congress are going to be and so forth.
So my sense is around issues of war and peace, one reason there's polarization is when you talk about active nonviolence being at the center, a lot of people say, but that doesn't work. Now, you cited Chenoweth and Stefan, who make the case that nonviolence actually does work. And Professor Omar, you are a peace studies professor. What do you think about that? Could you say a little bit more about the effectiveness of nonviolence and including how has that played out in your own experience as an imam and a peace activist in South Africa, and also you specialize in Africa generally. So what about that affect the claim that active nonviolence actually is effective?
Thank you, Jerry. As a peace studies scholar and practitioner, Cardinal McElroy's call for prioritizing nonviolent action resonates with me very deeply. In fact, in response to Pope Francis' encyclical Fratelli Tutti, I had written a response in which I embraced it, and in fact proposed that the Catholic Church should share what I call a commendable, ethical, moral calling of our times with other faith communities, including my own as a Muslim. And I proposed that it could be done by the Church arranging a number of sustained and interfaith dialogues on this calling within Fratelli Tutti. The task of this interfaith dialogue would be exactly to prioritize nonviolent action and to challenge, I would say, the traditional parameters of the just war theory, which I believe in our time, given the indiscriminate and destructive weapons of mass destruction available to us, it would be really a catastrophe. I want to go to, if you would permit me, to the South African example of nonviolent resistance against the oppressive and racist apartheid system, because I do think it has some important lessons, especially for the Ukraine. In South Africa, nonviolent resistance, as many of us would know, was led by the late Archbishop Desmond Mpilo Tutu, including a number of leaders from other religious communities, including Muslims, Jewish, Hindus, and people of African traditional communities. And in fact, the very robust and civil society followed the lead of these religious leaders, and we advocated nonviolent strategies such as the boycott and divestment campaign to isolate the apartheid regime. But during the negotiations and the transition towards a non-racial and democratic South Africa, it was political parties that were engaged in the negotiations, many of whom were advocating revolutionary violence. Violent resistance, of course, legitimate against the oppressive apartheid regime. Now, Archbishop Tutu always used to remind us, this is very important, that violence and killing, even if it is done in defense of human rights, even if it's done as a last resort, it dehumanizes all of us. So when violence is perpetrated in defense of human rights, it requires sensitive and long-term moral rehabilitation and deep spiritual and psychological healing, even on the part of the victims who are fighting a just war. This is a very painful lesson that we in South Africa are currently learning, because we are trying to make sense of the high levels of violence in post-apartheid South Africa. The levels of homicide is one of the highest in the world. So this is, I think, also a lesson that we should be very mindful of in the Ukraine. Once the Russian aggression in Ukraine has been successfully repelled, and we hope that will be very soon, inshallah, God willing. There is no guarantee that that society will be free of violence.
Professor O'Connell, you specialize in international law, and international law has a general prohibition on the use of military force and obligates states to settle disputes peacefully. So people always think of international law that way, but in a way, international law is about nonviolence. But how do you make those principles more effective through international law and international institutions?
Jerry, you're absolutely right. At the very heart of the international legal order is the prohibition on the use of military force. And in classic law, there is only one acceptable reason or one narrowing of the prohibition. And that is when a sovereign state has been attacked by another sovereign state, and that attacked state, that victim state, is facing an ongoing challenge of armed conflict. These principles are codified in the United Nations Charter in Article 2.4 and Article 51. But owing to a number of, and you'll note, Your Eminence and others, that these are restatements of the classic just war tradition, not what we've seen in more recent years. But these are principles that grew out of Catholic teaching about the prohibition on force, about the need for alternatives to violence to settle all disputes, except that one significant problem when a state is being invaded and is the victim of aggression. And then there are severe limits even in that situation, which would speak to Rashid's point. The war must end when there is no longer an ongoing violent conflict, when troops are removed. And if you do not participate in removing them, if that defense lags, then after a period of non-fighting, there has to be alternatives to using military force, to taking up force again, even to remove an occupier, a military occupier. So this is all from classic just war teaching. This is what was codified in the United Nations Charter. If I was going to add anything to the Cardinal's remarks, it would be to say that Pacem and terris focuses in on that law. International law is invoked in Pacem and terris, as is the United Nations. Pope John XXIII looked to the United Nations and said, it is through the instrument of the UN, bringing all the worlds, all of their different traditions, every major faith extols peace. We bring them together, we bring that law, or bring those ideas into the law. But what happened? What happened between 1945 and the adoption of the Charter, 1963 and the Pope's invocation of law and institutions to fulfill his Catholic vision of a world at peace. 1983, when we get the challenge of peace, that's really backtracking in important ways from Pacem and terris to today. And I would suggest to you it's one particular ideology, and it's reversing and pushing back on that ideology that will allow us to once again focus on defense, focus on peace, focus on alternatives to violence. It's really an intellectual construct, a simple idea that grew up in universities that we have really the power to reverse, maybe starting right here now. It's an idea of realism, that the world doesn't work on law or ethics or morality or goodness or alternatives to violence, that we human beings only understand coercion. We can only be bought or we can only be forced to do things. We don't do things out of altruism. We don't do things out of a sense of generosity and love. It's a total reversal of what we Christians believe, and yet we bought it. We bought it out of a sense of fear. We were sold this bill of goods because we were told that the only way to really be secure as a nation in an atomic era is to buy into realist deterrence theory. And we have shifted so dramatically to that view. We have invested in a view of deterrence, in offense as the best defense, and given up on investing in defense. International lawyers, ethicists, just war theorists all followed this intellectual construct. They gave up on their traditional views, their traditional ethics, to buy into this view that only deterrence, only having the latest weapons will make us secure. It's become such a powerful idea that if you even say, we can do something different than deterrence theory, we don't need to invest in the latest weapons. We need to invest in the latest defense, the latest alternatives. Not only are you told you're naive, you're told it will not work, that you're exposing your country to harm. And yet, it's that very thinking that drove Russia to invade Ukraine. They had to be ahead of others. They had to use offense. They had to show the world they were willing to use military force, and they're even willing to use a nuclear weapon to show that they're as good, as strong, et cetera, as the United States. And now China is projecting the same. We have to stop this idea. We need to and we can move back to the idea of defense, to the idea of alternatives to violence, to renewing what international law actually says, to calling out false interpretations of what the Charter holds and what just war teaching holds, what ethics holds. That's how we can make these institutions more effective for all these causes that we hold so dear. We need to go back to Pacem and terris.
General Levitt, you've been very patient. Thank you. You've had a career in the military, including in the nuclear military. There's talk of bringing nonviolence into the public realm, which is what the U.S. bishop said ought to be done back in 1993 in one of their major statements. Does that talk make any sense to you? You talked about excessive militarism. I wonder.
It makes sense to me personally. So I was thinking of the Cardinal's remarks about the word pacifism. If pacifism means nonviolence, then I'm all for it. And my answer to that is, if we, if the church, if the Pope doesn't take it on, who will? So I would wear that. The question of nuclear pacifism, and as you point out, I spent a good deal of my career up close and personal with nuclear weapons. I again would wear that moniker of nuclear pacifist very proudly. I think nukes are evil. My thinking on this has changed in the last 40 years, but I think they're weapons of terror, and although I think my military friends wouldn't agree with me, I don't think they have any military value to speak of. They just leave the battlefield a mess. If I may answer a question you didn't ask me, and that has to do with just war theory. And I was glad to hear you say that just war theory was not going to be abandoned, because I think it is a really important concept for the military. I've talked to many military chaplains and others who think that having that framework, just war theory and the laws of armed conflict, is very, very important. So thank you.
When you write about excessive, let me just come back to you. You write about excessive militarism. What do you have in mind when you talk about excessive militarism in U.S. foreign policy?
Oh gosh. So yeah, in Future Peace, I wrote a lot about it. Militarism is on a rampage all over the world. In the U.S., you just go on and on. The deployments, the number of deployments that we've sent our military on since the all-volunteer force came into being is just incredible. We're spending almost $1 trillion a year on the military. We may not be getting much for that, but we're spending almost $1 trillion. More than the next 7 countries combined. And Russia, by the way, they have a much smaller GDP. They're spending a larger fraction of their GDP on the military. So in the book, I also talk about former Nobel Peace Prize winners and their attempt to push nonviolence and the reaction that they got mostly from their countries, abuse, imprisonment. So militarism is rampant. And Cardinal, I was glad to read your book, Morality and American Foreign Policy, and when it talked about the internationalists after World War I and what could be done to bring morality into foreign policy. One of the things that was actually mentioned was education. And that's the other thing I found is that the correlation between poor education and militarism and nationalism and xenophobia and all of those bad things is very strong. So I could go on and on. I won't do that, but that's when I say militarism, that's what we have to work on. That's the antidote to militarism is a thinking of nonviolence.
Let me move to 2 points that Cardinal McElroy made. The first was, and this relates to your comment that the military needs a just war. Your Eminence, you say that there's a couple areas of the jus ad bellum, which describes the criteria for when you can go to war. There are a few areas of jus ad bellum that don't address today's problems. For example, war termination and the moral responsibilities of those who support in collective self-defense, Ukraine or in similar cases. And then the second question I want to move to is nuclear disarmament. But on the first point could you elaborate just a bit about what you see as the problem and how you think we ought to think about that problem of the just war tradition?
Sure. Just war tradition is an ancient tradition in the church. And at various stages, it had a lot of reinforcement in society. That is, because in the medieval cultures, you couldn't fight on a holy day. And there were about 100 holy days in a year. So you had to stop fighting. Then there were truces.
Never on Sunday.
Never on Sunday, no. And certain periods of the year you couldn't fight. There was a system backing of course, there were much smaller wars we're talking about then in the Middle Ages. But there was a way of breaking the cycle in war. And so one of my concerns is we don't have that. We don't have those supports now. And so how do we bring to the just war approach? See, I have a problem with the use just war now. I think, nonviolence at the center, that's why I use the word, and I'm not wedded to that word, but in extremis. There are certain situations in extremis, but I want to emphasize that. This is not the normal situation. It's not the normal conflict. It's in extremis. And so, as I mentioned, what's called the jus in bello in just war was you can't intentionally target civilians, non-combatants, and that every act you do in war has to be proportioned to the good it will accomplish. The evil it does has to be proportioned. Those are absolutely crucial elements to maintain in any ethics of how we should fight war or morally should be allowed in extremis. I point out 2 other areas I think need to be brought into play. I do think the areas of general proportionality, the areas of last resort, and the areas and right intention and grave cause. I think those are all important elements. I think the whole thing needs to be reforged, though, in a way that faces certain realities, which it doesn't. And I don't like using the term just war, I have to say.
Jerry's letting me respond to this because I'm making signals to him. We really don't need a reformation of the just war theory. We need to go back to what Pope John the 23rd said, which is to track the just war doctrine to our commonly held, our human-wide, our global understanding of what the law requires in the United Nations Charter. And it says that there is no right to use major military force except when a state has been attacked been the victim of a significant ongoing armed attack. Then there is a right under the jus ad bellum to respond, but only to the extent necessary to end the armed attack, the ongoing armed attack, and only in a way that is proportionate to the injury that you have suffered. And then you also add in the restrictions in the use in bello, how you are fighting. You never target civilians, never. You always target only military objectives, and then only to the extent that is necessary to accomplish the military objective. If you look at that law, that is what the just war doctrine was meant to say, and we've got it there. You say in your remarks, the just war doctrine doesn't tell us when wars end. It's deficient, but international law is not. If the only right to resort to military force is when a state has been the victim of an armed attack, then when that armed attack is over, so in the case of Ukraine, when Russian troops are moved out of the country, when Ukraine prevails, or when Ukraine consents to some other end to the war, that is when the war is over. But you look at all these other armed conflicts, and you say, well, where's the just war theory telling us when those wars should end? They never should have begun, so they should end immediately. That's why it seems like international law, it seems like the just war doctrine is deficient. What's really deficient is our knowledge today of what these ancient legal normative principles require. We have allowed our whole disciplines to be captured by these theories of realism, of deterrence, of militarism. They are a common set, and we need to free ourselves of them. To me, I get great hope by the fact that this incredible construct that accounts for $1 trillion invested in offensive uses of force, where the creation, the origin, you can see the story, you can trace it back just some decades to the 1950s, and a mid-level diplomat named George Kennan giving a speech at the University of Chicago where he says we've got to end American foreign policy based on law and morality and shift to a foreign policy based on realism that's based on having a larger military force than our opponents, the Soviets. This is popularized through an international law professor named Hans Morgenthau. And we bought it. Why? Because we did have so much wealth, because we could pretend to ourselves that having all these weapons would keep us secure. We shifted what mattered to us to the God of security. One of my Israeli colleagues has written a book called The Theology of Security. We want physical security, and we've given up so much for it, and we don't have it. We live in fear of a nuclear war instead of investing in what would really reverse that fear, instead of investing in what would really make life on Earth flourish. $1 trillion to protect the climate. Where would we be? Education, as the general said, is really the key, but we need a certain kind of education that returns these classic ideas. We need to reach out to our students now and teach them true international law, regardless of what's being spoken in Washington or Moscow. And we need to teach true just war doctrine, true ethics of peace.
So realism is behind the ethic of and strategy of nuclear deterrence. And that was a nuclear
and
deterrence.
projecting military force,
Right.
as the U.S. does so often, to show that we are the hegemon, we are the untouchable power.
But since the end of the Cold War, you had not only religious leaders, but you also had major political, military leaders say that we can move toward nuclear disarmament. And after the Pope's statement in the 2017 Vatican Conference condemning both possession of nukes and the use of nukes, a senior NATO official told me, a good Catholic, told me that the Pope's statement was dangerous because it would undermine NATO's nuclear deterrence strategy. But we're in a really different situation in some ways, even from 2017, largely because of Ukraine. Putin's nuclear saber rattling, the suspension just recently of New START, which was the last remaining U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control agreement, with the massive nuclear modernization program that is underway on the part of all the nuclear powers. We're projected to be spending $1.7 trillion on new nukes in the next couple decades. And there's talk of a new Cold War. So is it naive and utopian for the church and others to continue to talk about the nuclear deterrence is immoral and we got to move toward nuclear disarmament? I mean, sounds like we're back in the early 80s again when the U.S. bishops issued their peace pastoral. This is for any of you. This is for this is for any of you.
Okay, let me try and do that. I think I want to back up a little bit and give you a kind of a global south perspective since I'm wearing this hat. Okay. So the idea that, very important, the idea that powerful nations such as the US, France, the UK, China, and Russia should enjoy the right to possess nuclear arms for so-called deterrence purposes is disingenuous and preposterous. There's no moral justification for some elite and powerful nations of the world possessing weapons of warfare which will annihilate humanity and then working on preventing other nations for the same reason. We should stand firm, I believe, in our moral clarity that nuclear warheads and all forms of weapons of mass destruction should be banned, period. And we should not be apologetic. We are not naive and we are not utopian to condemn nuclear deterrence because we could very soon stand on the precipice of such a disaster. I think that would be my unequivocal response in that regard.
General Latif?
Very quickly. I agree. I think we should continue to condemn nukes, condemn nuclear deterrence, have as a goal disarmament and nuclear zero. But I do think that we are naive and utopian to believe that will ever actually happen. With apologies to my friends David Courtwright and Jerry Powers and many others, things are just going in the opposite direction. Is it naive and utopian? Maybe those aren't the right words, but as a goal, I think disarmament and nuclear zero are very good goals, and we should be working toward them. But I would prefer personally that we begin with lowering the numbers, and those are the kind of things that we can do unilaterally.
I have one sentence. $1.7 trillion invested in defense. Is that naive? Well, the same incredible scientists that gave us nuclear weapons in the first place, those same research scientists who are now giving us fully autonomous robotic weapons, unbelievable technology, are they really not capable, given the right orders, given the right monies, to invent the defense that we need so that people don't feel afraid to stop building more offensive weapons? We're only doing this because of an idea of deterrence, which is a flawed idea, not based on empirical evidence, only based on a hunch that people will respond to coercion and fear more than they will respond to generosity, cooperation, a different vision. That's 3 sentences. But
No one's counting.
The very last one is that we should have as much confidence in our intelligence and our resources to invent true deterrence, true security in defense. Why is that so naive? We have to get off this train. We have to listen to the rest of the world, except the 9 nuclear states who believe this.
General Latif, you're an expert on cyber. Is cyber an alternative to nuclear deterrence? Because I think that's what you were saying.
No, absolutely not.
I'm sorry, okay.
I'd like to hear what Bob thinks about cyber, but
I misunderstood what you were
first,
saying.
there's no such thing as cyber weapons. Cyber is a means of communication. But I said fully autonomous robotic weapons are an incredible use of a demonstration, as is everything cyber, of what we could accomplish if we were pursuing the right goals. I definitely do not want any more research in offensive autonomous weapons, and that's what we're investing in now. Not defensive weapons, not defenses in general, but more offense, because deterrence tells us you must stay ahead technologically from your competitors. That's the only way to stay secure. It has abandoned the orientation of defense.
Very general.
Correct?
I've lost the bubble on what the question is. But.
Is the cyber, all the new tech, does that have offer some sort of an answer to some of the moral dilemmas we face with nuclear deterrence and militarism that you're talking about?
I think conventional weapons are so advanced, cyber, hypersonic weapons, a lot of non-nuclear weapons would fill the bill. We don't need nuclear weapons. And so the technologies are there. I mean, you're right. The technologies, the people who designed Star Wars back in the 1980s, they were onto something. Wasn't going to work back then, but.
Cardinal.
I can just say one thing about deterrence. It's often said deterrence has worked. I don't believe that. It's like, you know how a magician says to you, "Look where my hands aren't," and then look away. When we say deterrence works, what you mean is we built these weapons, horrific weapons, to make sure that, in this case, Russia really, didn't use their specific horrific weapons to battle us. And we've succeeded in that. But if you're saying deterrence in terms of preventing warfare and violence precipitated by, let's just focus on the Russians and us, okay? Look at Syria, look at these various areas in which client wars go on. We have not deterred that, and we have now failed in deterrence in the Ukraine. So how do you say deterrence worked? Only if you look at, did we use our nuclear weapons to attack their nuclear weapons? Did they use their nuclear weapons to attack us? Deterrence in terms of saying, how do we preserve peace in the world? Nuclear weapons have not done that. We've had all these conflicts in which other countries are brutalized, and conflicts between, frankly, us and Russia on many different levels over these years. So I don't accept the argument that deterrence has worked, except that it says, yes, we've not used our nuclear weapons to attack their nuclear weapons, and that's the conflagration.
And that is also only a correlation. We do not have empirical evidence of causation at all. That's the reason. Mutually assured destruction is only a theory. It's not been proven. We do not have, I can give you plenty of alternative proof of what actually works to prevent wars. And it's not fear of the other. It's cooperation with the other.
Professor Omar, did you want to?
No.
We've been talking about nuclear weapons and a lot about Ukraine, but what about some of the other conflicts that people aren't paying attention to? And some of those conflicts are in Africa. What are you seeing? What are Westerners not seeing that you're seeing in terms of some of these other conflicts, and some of which were proxy conflicts during the Cold War? But what are we missing?
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much for that question, because I think it provides me an opportunity to present a different perspective, a global South perspective, which I think should be very valuable for all of us. I believe it should not only be a global South perspective, but I think a rational and a meaningful perspective. So in large parts of the globe, they have not been as gung-ho, and I use that word very deliberately, on the Ukraine-Russian war. Why would that be the case? Because people see palpable injustice in the global power system from the point of view of the South. Most of the countries and citizens of the Global South, I should say, have unequivocally condemned the Russian invasion and aggression in the Ukraine. But at the same time, they have also been disappointed at the hypocrisy and the double standards of NATO and the US and its allies. And it's not impossible to hold both of those positions together. So citizens of the Global South, for example, we have witnessed, shortly after the war broke out in the Ukraine, how Ukrainian refugees were received with great compassion and generosity in Europe. The same compassion and generosity, however, is not shown to African refugees and people with darker pigmentations of skin. So many people in the Global South are then left wondering also why the sustained and same attention and resources, as you've asked, is not expended to other deadly conflicts, such as the long-standing war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Southern Sudan, Syria, Yemen. And it's important, I mean, I'm not a Catholic, but this is very important, that the Pope Francis took a peace pilgrimage whilst the war in Ukraine is happening to the DRC and Southern Sudan. His testimony, and this was not lost on the people of the Global South. For example, in his address, Pope Francis criticized the international community for what he called Congo's forgotten genocide, unquote. He used those words. And he condemned the plundering of the Democratic Republic of Congo for its resources, including many companies based in the West. So if I may add, people in the Middle East, for example, they are left wondering why NATO and the United States make a legitimate, strong case for armed resistance in the Ukraine against Russian aggression. But they turn a blind eye to the sustained and barbaric actions of the apartheid state of Israel to Palestinians. So this double standards injustice is captured in the a brutal assassination of an American Palestinian journalist by the name of Shireen Abu Akleh on May the 11th, 2022. Shireen Abu Akleh was not a Muslim. She was a devout member of the Melkite Catholic Church. The United States has consistently refused to support an independent commission of inquiry into her death. And so the Israeli regime faces absolutely no consequence for the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. So daily scores of innocent Palestinians are killed with impunity by Israel's settler colonial occupation of Palestinian lands. And people in the South then are left astounded at the hypocrisy and the double standards of the United States. So the moral lesson is that we can condemn, and we should, the Russian aggression, but we can also at the same time look at the world and say that, there are these discrepancies, and we can hold both of them together. It's not either or. Thank you, Jerry, for
Your Eminence, we're almost out of time, so you have the last word.
I would just say a couple of things. I think we're in a moment in which the whole question of nonviolence is becoming more prominent. I think there's a challenge to us as Catholics, as people of goodwill, to try to reinforce that. Secondly, I do think this question of the nuclear issue, how do we make it an important question in the public mind? To me, the hardest thing always is
How do you get people to focus on something? It's at all levels. It's the university. You know, I'm a bishop, so I want our diocese, the parishes to do something. And I've got to say, you got to focus on this. And then they get resistant, you know. How do you get focus on this question of the nuclear peril such that I believe if we could get focus, we could make progress? Because I'm not sure that on the nuclear issues, the polarization is as much of a problem. I really think there could be a lot of commonality on the nuclear questions, on steps toward you know, and particularly with, as you're saying, with the reduction of numbers. So I just say how, you know, I would say that to the university and to the school as a whole, it's partly our responsibility as bishops too. How do we put focus on this question so we're not here 20 years from now saying, you know, that moment passed too. It was a great moment when Secretary of State Schultz, you know, did so much. He was a great man. Focus on this question. And he had Henry Kissinger on board and Bill Perry. These were all leaders from different ideological elements of different parties to really try to move toward moving the question internationally in concert with other policymakers in the world. And I thought, boy, this really has a chance, but it never got traction. It never got focus. So I think that's the big challenge. How do we get traction for that?
Okay, well, we'll get to work.
That's right.
We regret that you did not accept our invitation to come 51 years ago, but we're delighted that you did today.
Yes. Well, I know my mistakes.
So it really has been a privilege and honor to have you with us. You've certainly enriched our ongoing dialogue about pressing issues of war and peace. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so please join me in thanking Cardinal McElroy, our panelists, and Father Jenkins and his office, who sponsored this event. They do terrific work. Pardon? Thank you all for coming. We have refreshments served in the back, and we are adjourned.